Morning, everyone. Welcome to the continuing public hearings and deliberations of the proposed regional climate change strategy. I might ask Dean to open our meeting with karakia, please.
Tātou ka mihi ki a tātou, ki rungi te kaupapa rānei. Te mata tō tātou hui, ki rungi te kupu te atua. E te atua nā tupuna te aki manaki a mātou ki rungi te koro o tā rānei. Ki awhi ane a mātou, o tō tātou, huri o tō tātou ao. Nā rei te atua te aki manaki a mātou i ngā wākato. Huri ki a koe i rongo ki a iri aki ki ronga whakamaua ki a tina. Haumi e hui e, tā e ki e. Ki ora tātou.
Thank you. So I just want to run through a little bit of guidance to establish the context for today's meeting. First of all, thank you for those who are attending, and I just want to make sure that everyone understands that this meeting is being live streamed. This is a meeting held in public. It is not a meeting of the public. Council is always happy to see our community in attendance. The meeting is for councillors to debate with each other and not to debate with attendees. While this is happening, it's important that the meeting is not disrupted, and I would remind those attending to respect the democratic process and note that no disrespectful or offensive language or behaviour is to be displayed. Things get unruly in the public gallery, we will stand up and ask for quiet, and if things come down, the meeting can carry on. If disruption continues, we may have to ask that those disrupting the meeting leave, and the meeting might be adjourned while that happens. We will aim to continue the meeting once things have been resolved. What else have I got before we get into it? Just to note that today the main focus of the meeting is primarily or predominantly going to be concerned with deliberations on the range of public submissions and public hearings which occurred last week on Thursday. But we do have one final public submission, and we're going to start with that this morning. And that is Jacob from Fish and Game here to speak to your submission.
Thank you.
We've got about 10 minutes, Jacob, and so everyone has had a copy of your submission and read through it. So if you perhaps just want to take 5 or 6 minutes to speak to the pertinent points you want to emphasise,
yes,
and then there might be some questions of clarification that follow.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, my name's Jacob Smythe. I'm here on behalf of Fish and Game, and I think I've met you all over the years, but thank you for this opportunity. In short, Fish and Game acknowledge that the 4 local councils must respond to climate change predictions for Southland. And this comment's made with reference to the 2018 report by NIWA, which looked at the potential for effects of climate change over the century, i.e. by 2100. In response, Fish and Game strongly support the intent of the climate change strategy to unite efforts across the 4 councils to address climate change. And in short, this makes good sense. This includes Fish and Game supporting the 4 key aspirations of the climate change strategy. Fish and Game consider that the strategy is a good start, but not necessarily the end point. And in fairness, I don't think that's the intent. I do note that it's to phase 1 and more will come in time. In addition, Fish and Game suggests that the 4 local government councils, including Southland Regional Council, Invercargill Council and Gore District Council, should 1, contribute to New Zealand's emission reduction targets, and specifically consider through their plans, including regional policy statement and regional and district plans, the emissions profiles of both permitted activities and consents granted under those plans. Secondly, the council should seek to mitigate the impacts of climate change on communities through measures such as making room for rivers, wetland restoration and floodplain management. And in fairness, I do note that that's one of the matters that is sought to be dealt with through the long-term plan submissions on which are being heard tomorrow onwards. This includes considerations around managed retreat of vulnerable infrastructure and properties, and also upgrading of outdated infrastructure. Fish and Game does consider that one aspect that needs to be dealt with the community is engagement with respect to both understanding the need for managed retreat and why it is essential. Those are the main points I wish to make today, and I'd certainly encourage questions in relation to those, particularly around why Fish and Game holds those views and any others that the panel may have.
Good. Yeah, thank you. That was very efficient.
Sorry, maybe too efficient. Sorry.
That's a positive thing.
Much prepared long one, so.
Yeah, we'll take some questions of
Okay.
clarification. And Tom, you've got
Thank you.
a question.
Jacob, well, firstly, thank you for support for the proposal. Could I just ask, the things that you've listed as being important are actually quite generic in the sense that I can imagine you sitting at any such meeting anywhere in New Zealand and saying exactly the same things.
Yes.
So I wonder whether there is anything which you have said or which you want to add about Southland specifically.
Yes. Yes. Well, I mean, I can give you an example about something that's Southland specific is around management of rivers, for example. And one of the things we hear a lot about is in relation to dealing with flooding is a very good example. And one thing that is very clear from surveys that Lights Southland Regional Council has done is that there's been significant modification of rivers in Southland with an adverse effect in terms of natural character and specifically the loss of things like channel capacity in terms of both channel length and channel width. And one very good thing that can be done in Southland is to look at the extent of change over time and what opportunities exist to deal with issues around both low flow and peak flow, because certainly communities are concerned about that aspect. And I think there is opportunities beyond simply an engineered response. And that's one thing that there has been a lot of advice to council around is what can be done there other than simply a command and control response, but to look to more one that is based around restoration, whilst also addressing community need for protection in some locations. A good example being something like Wyndham, for example, which is very, very vulnerable. So that would be a Southland specific example that I can think of off the top of my head. Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions, Keith?
You didn't mention the one word that I was expecting you to mention with regard to rivers, and that's gravel.
Yes, I'm happy to talk about that, although we only have 10 minutes. So, yeah, I mean, obviously one of the concerns raised at a community level around gravel is principally around the idea of gravel aggradation. What I don't know is whether that is a concern that is based upon evidence or whether it's concern based upon anecdote. And the reason I say that is what we do know about rivers in Southland, particularly when we look at the lower Matilda and the lower Reti, is that they're extremely degraded with respect to loss of gravel to the extent that we've got issues with exposure of the underlying lignite bed and also the result of impacts upon infrastructure, particularly through undercutting. I do know that one of the things that Environment Southland or Southland Regional Council is looking to do through the long-term plan is more monitoring around gravel, which I think is a very good thing to do because certainly we've got genuine issues. And that will hopefully look to address issues around channel capacity and whether there's actually been a reduction as a result of gravel aggradation. I do know that's been looked at already in the Matilda between, I think, Ardnasser down to Riversdale. And actually it found, though, comparing cross-sectional surveys between 2012 and 2023, i.e. post the flooding in 2020, that actually there hadn't been a net aggradation. In fact, there would be little, if any change. So I think some of the monitoring, Keith, that's being proposed will be a good thing in terms of looking at whether those are genuine issues and what management strategies need to be adopted. Sorry, a long answer to a short question, but it doesn't lend itself to a very short answer.
Yes, Matt.
Thanks, Jacob. You mentioned managed retreat.
Yes.
Are you referring to that within floodplains, or what do you mean by?
Oh, well, principally in relation to, yes, areas where it's vulnerable, but not just in relation to floodplains, also coastal managed retreat potentially. I mean, for example, a good example might be roading, where it's located, where there's active erosion. I think over time we need to be looking at what can be done in terms of retreat. The idea, I think, trying to hold back some of these things like Kinkahoot is probably unlikely to be reality. So appreciate that in the short term you might need to take protective measures. I think we need to be also looking at the long-term vision of things like managed retreat. Obviously the difficulty is something that needs to happen in the middle, and probably frank conversations with communities that do have those threats where they may reside, or there may be infrastructure associated with those communities that's located. So
Infrastructure like bridges.
Bridges, yeah, would be a very good example. And not necessarily bridges in the sense that you get rid of the bridge, but you might need to actually have a new bridge, for example. You might need to make it wider to, and a good example would be something like the Upaka River Bridge on the Milford Road, which is a real pinch point. there's been a proliferation of works associated with trying to protect it. Long term, it's looking like it probably needs to be replaced. So, yeah. Thanks.
Nothing from you. Jacob, one of the features of this work is that we are collaborating across all of the councils and with Te Ao Marama Incorporated.
Yes.
As we move to the subsequent phase of work that is anticipated within the climate change strategy effort, we're probably looking to extend that collaborative effort to bring other stakeholders into the conversation.
Yes.
Any thoughts on the opportunities from a fish and game perspective around means of engaging with the wider stakeholder group?
Oh, I mean, certainly Fish and Game would be very keen to be involved. And I think one of the ways that Fish and Game can make a positive contribution to that is with its expertise in the likes of wetland development. And I think that's a really good example where at a farm-based scale, you could do a lot of things about water capture and retention, both from a water quality point of view, but also a water quantity point of view in dealing with things like peak flows, but also having water available below low flow periods as well. And I see opportunities probably less so in terms of building big things at the bottom and the ends of catchments, but actually proliferation at a farm scale would be something that Fish and Game could certainly be involved in and assist with, and would really welcome that opportunity. So we would certainly build hundreds, if not thousands, of similar structures over the years. So,
yep. Thank you. Any other final questions from the panel?
I wonder then, as iwi we see Mataranga Māori and we also see Mahinga Kai as an indicator of health and wellbeing.
yes.
Is there obvious Fish and Game sort of have the same reflect similarly in terms of their species and stuff like that, so that we get those right in the environment then the things that we're trying to achieve, including climate change.
Yes. Well, in short, the answer is yes. And Fish and Game, I mean, whilst our statutory ambit is in relation to freshwater fish which are introduced, we also though have management functions in relation to indigenous bird species, which are also Tonga species for iwi, for example, paradise shell duck. So certainly there is a commonality there, and also what we want is a functioning ecosystem that actually provides for all fish and bird species within it. So, and some of that will be actually advantageous to the wider community as well, for example. The likes of having retention areas which can have benefits for habitat, but also in terms of dealing with issues around peak flows or low flows, for example. So in short, yes, there's the support and the reasoning for that.
Thanks, Jacob.
Jacob, that's a 10-minute limit.
Yes,
and out of
fairness
and equity to all of the presenters, we've been pretty disciplined in that respect. But I just want to thank you very much for taking the time to both submit and then to come in and speak to your submission. And there is going to be a written response provided to all submitters once we've progressed through the deliberation process. So there is some feedback that will be provided.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.
Good luck to the deliberations.
Thank you. For the panel, just as Jacob's tidying up, on Friday I met with Anka and we thought through how best to structure the conversation that we need to have today in respect of the deliberations. And we thought perhaps the first thing we might do was just to allow space for some critical reflection from the panel members before we dive into the detail. And so maybe if I could just encourage you to take a couple of minutes to gather your thoughts, and then we might go around the panel and just capture key reflections on what we've heard, what we've read, and what we've heard in the public submissions in the last couple of engagements. So perhaps if you could just take a couple of minutes and we'll share our thoughts accordingly. As we prepare to share our thoughts, we might start north to south.
It's amazing.
You happy to perhaps go first, Matt, offer your thoughts and reflections?
Yeah, sure.
So reading through all the submissions, hearing the submitters that have taken the time to come and speak to us, there definitely are some kind of themes. It appears to me that there's overwhelming support for the adaptation function of what's proposed in phase 1 part of the strategy. There's an acknowledgement that the climate is changing, and that always needs adaptation as far as planning and in order to have resilient infrastructure. It's noted floodplain management and coastal management and those types of things. There's a role for local government to play, and there's good support for the collaboration of the agencies in that. Where some of the debate more lies, I feel, is in the mitigation level of the overall discussion. I guess a lot of it touches on the global consideration of emissions and addressing climate change. What can be done in Murihiku is one part, but this is also a global conversation. So there's a lot of different views in terms of the data used, the historic context of climate change and different, various times in history that have had different changes of climate, and then what role the Industrial Revolution and CO2 emissions, man-made, have had in that. So there's a lot of discussion around just how data is analysed, what is CO2 versus methane, what is gross versus net, and also how does the emissions trading scheme kind of work at a local level in regards to the global picture of it. So my initial kind of feeling on the things is that there's overwhelming support in the adaptation, but some conversation around how to navigate the mitigation without dismissing any concerns around how data is analysed, and essentially the principles and aspirations in the phase document do acknowledge that having science and Maparonga underpinning the process would hopefully address those concerns of approaching science and data with a true scientific mind of science is always there to be challenged. The other requests from submitters of just ensuring that the process is transparent, inclusive with equitable outcomes, the process of local government to focus on core business, but that does include planning and infrastructure and things. So having an adaptation mind to that is obviously quite important to the community. Yeah, it's been a very interesting process to capture the community sentiment around a pretty serious topic, and it's not a new topic, and it's not one that's going to go away quickly either. But I think there's support in the process and the collaboration, and as long as we're kind of willing to incorporate everyone's view into the process, in a good place.
Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Wonderful summary. And just really to add a few things to that, one of the words I wrote down was hoax. That climate change is a hoax, and there was a number of presentations coming through, which were also presentations which at the same time were opposition to the net zero by 2050. So to me, it came back to the measuring point where you started. There was talk of the small ice age versus others that were focusing on CO2 either being an appropriate measure or an inappropriate measure. And that's something I think that we need to talk through. The collaborative approach had strong support from all sides. And from both sides of the argument in terms of the cause of climate change, as Matt highlighted, adaptation was seen as appropriate with priorities for the rivers and the coast, and how you respond to that. I think for a number of the submissions, some actually missed the point in terms of it being a local authority document as opposed to promoting public change. But if you're looking at adaptation, that will impact on the public, and it reinforces the need for that collaborative approach moving forward. Again, the size of New Zealand versus the size of the world. I was thinking over the weekend of the take of the song "We Are the World" that was "We Are the Worms." And if you look upon New Zealand at a scale, we are the worm compared to the rest of the world. But think of what the worms actually do in terms of their benefit. So we do have a role to play in terms of the stance that we take on different things. Also noted that a point that was missed, I thought, by those arguing against climate change was our legal responsibilities. And I think a number of the presentations we had, while they were great to hear, are probably more appropriately directed at the government, particularly in terms of what's set out in the legislation. So from a mitigation point of view, we've got a statutory role that until the legislation's changed, we're required to continue with it.
Thank you. Sorry, Tom.
You've been promoted.
Well, I agree with everything that's been said, but for me, we heard from three distinct groups. One was a group that denied anthropogenic climate change, but even they, through the charts that they used, tended to accept that there was natural slow warming or sea level rise. They might argue that it was coming from a reversal of the Little Ice Age, but nevertheless, so second group to me were those who broadly accepted what was in the document, but wished to challenge particular things. The risk factor, which actually is not in the document, but the use of 8.5 as a national guideline, is being too severe that I think at least a couple of the submitters argued. The means for accounting for methane in particular and generally how the inventory is calculated, which of course is a global thing rather than certainly it's not a regional thing. But that was argued, and the word gravel came up more than once. So were those, I thought, in the middle who had particular issues that they wanted to talk about, but broadly were supportive. And then the third group were those who were fully supportive and came with particular emphasis, came from, Health New Zealand, Forest and Bird, Fish and Game, Fonterra, they came and, argued their corner. I thought cross-cutting all of that, you say, how can the groups possibly agree on anything? I thought there's two things that seemed to me that all of them agreed on. The first was the collaborative approach, the four councils working together. I heard that from pretty much everybody. And the second one was the need for adaptation. So even those, or most of those that did not agree with the anthropogenic nature of climate change, still acknowledged, there is sea level rise, the weather is changing, and that it was appropriate to be thinking about how we adapt to that. So they were the two things that I thought were cross-cutting that we could take from it. The issues that I think we need to, well, the risk factor 8.5 mentioned by more than one person. We need to think about whether that is, although that's guidance that we have from government at the moment, that guidance may change, but it has an enormous effect on how you actually approach the next stage. Anyway, but it was a great couple of days, a great day. This was today.
Well, I thought the submitters were well prepared and brought out their submissions really well and very passionate. In terms of their submissions, notice that submitters have varying degrees of acceptance or not of climate change. So obviously that's always going to happen. Climate change is recognised in two understandings, that it exists as a normal function of the Earth cycles. I heard that a little bit. And also the view it is human created. So that we have to recognise both in terms of our deliberations. Councils should work together to form an opinion and or strategy of action. So I think that's the rest of the panel sort of heard that as well. We all heard that we need to work together. I heard that there was some investment concerns in terms of the money that ratepayers and costs to ratepayers and their children going forward and bankrupting the et cetera, but also there's a cost if you don't do something. And to listen to our communities and to seek continued input from them going forward. So that was a common theme, that we need to work on this together. And again, heard it from the other panel members, a Southland adaptation model, and that, we did hear that there's a Southland, also a Southland solution to climate change, or how we deliver a strategy.
Thank you. I've got some reflections to share, but I just might pause for a moment, and just because shortly we're going to ask Anchor that PowerPoint presentation. Is that something that you can bring up from where you're sitting? Thank you. Some of the things that I was reflecting on was I acknowledge what Tom's sort of analysis that there's kind of three sort of broad camps, and even if you were to try and attempt an even more simple categorization of for or against, it seemed to me that there was sort of some clear patterns that emerged, and what was interesting is there was probably a slightly larger number of submissions that were weighted against acting on climate change. But interestingly, they all came from individuals, whereas those that you might broadly categorise as being supportive were a mix of individuals and organisations. And I was just reflecting on that, and for instance, the Federated Farmers Submission, who they noted that they're submitting on behalf of about 1,270 or so members of their organisation, and they asked for that sort of representation to be taken into account in terms of what they were submitting on. People like Fonterra and NGOs that submitted. It was interesting that split of organisations who submitted were broadly supportive of what we were posing, with some specific recommendations offered. And it seemed to me that perhaps one of the first tasks that we're going to need to do is to I kind of guess, evaluate and weigh the evidence on behalf of the region. Evaluating and weighing both the science, but also evaluating and weighing what is public opinion telling us as well. And I do take heart from the fact that we did do that public perceptions survey in the months towards the end of last year, which gave us a bit of an indication as to what portion of our community perhaps doesn't support the concept of anthropogenic climate change, and how much of our community is or remains concerned about that. And from that perception survey, it was quite clear that there was a rather minority group sitting at about 30%, it would seem from that survey, who were sitting in the camp of we don't support anthropogenic climate change. So that perhaps suggests to me that from a public opinion point of view, that might be more of a minority perspective than perhaps what the wider community is thinking when it comes to the climate change challenge. So thank you for sharing those reflections. And what we're about to do is we're going to possibly bring up a PowerPoint.
Yeah.
And I think you've got a handout of it
There is a printout.
and a printout of the...
That's the printout of the things that are on the paper.
Right. So before we met on Thursday, staff had gone through and had kind of extracted the themes that had emerged from all of the submissions. And I guess after hearing the submissions on Thursday and talking to Ank about it, we kind of thought to ourselves, let's attempt to categorise those themes under specific headings. And I guess that's what that handout there does. It takes the themes that we identified from the submissions and kind of puts them under sort of a number of headings. So the top heading was really my asking the question, does the Southern community, have we got a mandate for progressing the collaborative climate change strategy? And some of the themes to me seemed to connect with or relate to that particular question. Beyond that, then there was the question of, are there recommendations in respect of any of the strategy principles? Were there recommendations in respect of the strategy's aspirations? There was some feedback provided that to me seemed probably appropriate that we identify they are considerations to be carried forward into our phase 2 work as we develop the framework for action. And then a final category was whether there might be other recommendations or indeed other themes that the panel might have picked up during the process of the hearings on Thursday and this morning. And a couple of instances there where on that sheet there's an asterisk next to something. So for instance, opposition to modelling, support for modelling. That simply reflects that when we first listed those themes, they were listed together as a single theme, and we've kind of broken them out because one's in opposition, one's in support. Similarly, down under recommendations in respect of the strategy aspirations, support for Southern becoming a net zero region by 2050 and opposition to Southern becoming a net zero region by 2050. Okay. Cool. So what I was proposing was maybe using the themes as our basis is to perhaps step through these sort of the themes in this sequence, starting from a broad level and kind of like in a funnel type fashion and stepping our way down through them and just making sure that we're responding to the themes under these headings as we go. But I thought I'd just check in with the panel and just test your level of comfort with this approach.
Yep. So one question from me, and no doubt we'll get to it as we come here. But there's some things that seem to me, Phil, that we are obliged to accept, given that we are part of New Zealand, right? Number one, anthropogenic climate change is accepted nationally. You cannot not accept it, seems to me. Net zero by 2050 is a national objective. We have to buy into that. I think you could go earlier, but I don't think you could go later. The accounting methodology for methane, carbon dioxide, and so forth, that is given to us. So there's a limit to which there is any value, I think, in debating these things. Some things you just have to accept as we're part of New Zealand. We're obliged to accept these things. What do we do about it? So what do we do about it? It's maybe the debate rather than whether we accept them.
Yeah, I think that's a very valid point indeed. And I thought it was appropriate to at least make sure we have this conversation, and so that it's these important ideas are tabled in the deliberations.
I guess underpinning many of the submissions that have been lodged is what I see as a key issue in terms of the cause of climate change and how we actually deal with that. And that there's clearly two opposing views, and do we actually need to take a position on that or acknowledge both out there as being promoted by the science sector?
Yeah. I think it's appropriate that we do acknowledge that this remains contested, and perhaps also acknowledge within that the degree to which the level of consensus perhaps that is sitting with each of the different positions associated. Yeah.
I mean, on the clearly we don't have the capacity or the brain power, frankly, to decide to make a decision about where the weight of evidence sits. I mean, that's that is not what we do. But nationally, the weight of evidence, and internationally, the weight of evidence has been weighed in the balance, and anthropogenic is overwhelmingly supported. And I think that's where we've got to come from. I don't think we can, from first principles, try to judge the merits of the set of charts that we saw from several people of a little ice age compared to what you would get from the IPPC.
I agree, and as Phil said, we need to acknowledge both arguments, and really the strategy in its current form doesn't do that. And it's almost we're putting a foot in each camp, acknowledging that's what the messages are. One is in the majority at this stage, but we're not taking a position on it. Regardless of the cause of climate change, there are things that need to happen. And I think we've used the phrase actually changing climate rather than climate change deliberately.
I think on the science and data underpinning kind of part of this, if there's been a group that contests the interpretation of science and data, there seemed to be a lot of commonality on citation of where that belief of science or interpretation was coming from. So if you have a group contesting the scientific findings based on a different interpretation of science, but it's cited to always be the same, I think was it wrote down at one point, Dr. Happer was quite often cited as the argument for the submitter. So taking the approach of science underpinning the way forward, you got to take a look at all the science. But if then a group is citing one particular scientific view rather than a broad, if there's a group of people citing a small group of scientists or is it a small group of people citing a large group of scientists? So I haven't read all of the different climate change scientists in the world. I don't claim to have a grasp on it. But if there is a particular opinion on the matter and they seem to be citing one or a small particular point of reference for that opinion, then you need to consider that as part of the science and the data and the underpinning. But I guess it's also understanding the reference of, well, how wide is that scientific opinion versus how voiced is that scientific opinion?
I think it would be useful to include in the document the comment that, irrespective of individual belief about the nature of climate change, the fact of climate change means that adaptation becomes, I think words like that would be helpful, but I don't know that I would go maybe as far as Keith was, I think, suggesting that we kind of provide there is two scientific views. I mean, it's a bit like, United States, where every time you mention Charles Darwin, you got to mention the fact that there's another view about, creation. I would not go as far as that. I think that we are, frankly, obliged to accept the view that anthropogenic climate changes. We are obliged as being part of New Zealand, and New Zealand's accepted that. New Zealand government has accepted that.
Having had that discussion around the utility of the themes and our orientation towards them, do you have the presentation on your, could you bring up the next slide? And it was kind of this idea that in terms of each of the themes, as we respond to it and thinking about the strategy that's currently proposed, where an issue has been raised, is it appropriate to respond to it via amending the strategy as it currently is drafted? Should something be taken forward and included for consideration within the framework for action? Are there other solutions that could be considered, or might be some other action that's appropriate? Or does some issue that's been raised trigger a need for more information in order to further understand and sense make in respect of that? And potentially there are things that have been suggested, but we choose not to act upon, although we'd probably need to make sure we have an agreement on why we would choose not to act on something.
So on that point, one of the things that I put together and we liked that was the presentation from Health New Zealand. It seems to me that we believe, I'm sure correctly, that on balance, climate change is a bad thing, certainly a bad thing for the world, probably a bad thing for New Zealand. But it doesn't mean that every single aspect of it has to be portrayed as being bad. So when I think of health, for example, I got to ask myself the question that if the temperature of Southland increased by 2 degrees, would that actually result in worse health outcomes or better health outcomes? So there can be a balance. It doesn't have to be everything is going to be bad. So I was interested in that we got a kind of generic presentation from Health New Zealand, rather than something that thought about the Southland situation, where we are the asthma capital of the world. Will that actually get better if our climate improves to about the climate of Christchurch, for example? So and maybe as a general thing, those organisations that presented did tend to present from a national perspective, rather than what are the implications for us down here, which may be different than the national average.
Yeah, and maybe it reflects that as yet, maybe for some of those organisations, they don't yet have the information or sufficient data to perhaps comment on what is a local or regional perspective on these things. If people are comfortable with perhaps applying this, and we've got them also on the whiteboard, so we can easily refer to them, is that idea of, as we step through the themes, using this framework to consider what is the appropriate response needed in respect of something. And so if we were to use perhaps the next slide, for example, So those set of themes that emerge under the kind of, the question that emerges for me, can we agree that we've got a mandate for progressing a collaborative climate change strategy? Because I think it seems to make sense that we should seek agreement or consensus from the panel on this particular question, because much then will fall into place beyond that, it seems to me.
I was just going to say, you put a group in a room anywhere in the world and ask for a mandate in climate change, you're not going to get it, right? So you never got at least 100% mandate. I think on balance, the majority of people have supported where we are, and I would say the vast majority have supported the adaptation practices.
I go back to the perception survey that was done last year, where the question was asked if the council should take action to reduce climate change impacts, and 17% were against. And do we do more to address climate change? And 27% were against. So turning it around, 80% roughly were saying we should be doing more. And so I think it's a clear mandate from the work that was done last year that that's where we should be heading.
Yeah, no, I agree that what we heard supports getting a strategy in place, and it also supports Ngāi Tahu or iwi positions at the same time who have their own strategy and are doing a lot of work in that space.
And that's a good point, because I think whatever we promote and whatever we advance should not seek to displace the agency or sovereignty of any particular organisation. We should always acknowledge that we're not trying to impinge upon people's rights to take action themselves in response to climate change. And individual organisations may have a strategy. Individual councils will be able to take actions. So I think that's a valid point. I think what I heard also, and I think it's been mentioned in reflections, that that idea of working collaboratively as opposed to individually progressing this, there was a great deal of support for collaborative action, even for those who perhaps may not have agreed with the cause of climate change or a changing climate. They agreed that it made sense to continue to collaborate and probably share resources.
That seems unanimous, actually.
Yeah. I guess what I'm hearing is that around the panel, we kind of are hearing or agreeing that there is a mandate for continued action, and there's a continued mandate for working collaboratively to progress a regional climate change strategy.
Yep.
Amongst these themes was the question of scepticism and questioning of the science. I think for me, what I'm comfortable with in the current strategy is a commitment to building understanding, a commitment to building a community of learning, a learning community. And I guess to me that suggests that we should acknowledge we may not know all the answers as at this point in time, but there's a desire to understand more and make sense of the challenge to a greater degree moving forward, and to share that knowledge in a way that's transparent and inclusive of a wider community. So yes, the science might be challenged, but I think if we continue to commit to being open and transparent and sharing the science or the data or the information sets, the research that we do have access to, I think, to me, that makes sense as a reasonable mitigation against anyone who's challenging the science behind what we're doing.
There's a lot of science out there, and as Tom says, a lot of international science acceptance of climate change. But I suppose it's that science, that a fair bit of science around Southland, and where we've got gaps in that Southland science that we might need to continue with our action plan and framework for action and adaptation. So whether there's gaps in it or something that might make people more comfortable in terms of our moving forward.
Yeah,
there's a lot of science there.
Using that we need to acknowledge that there will be gaps that we would seek to
To
respond
just to review the science that we've got to see if it supports our framework for action. Because you can always look for more and more science, and while you're doing that, the climate change catches up on you, or incidents catch up on you. There's a fair bit out there, but there will be gaps, I'd imagine, for the south.
Through you, Chair, perhaps just to flow on from that comment and in response to the various comments about RCP or ECSP, or in other words, which climate change scenario the councils are basing their modelling on, I just really wanted to highlight that the strategy doesn't put forward a position on that, other than that there is a desire to work towards a common position, and instead really does focus on investing in the data needed to make that informed decision down the track. And clearly there is national guidance in this space at the moment, but each council has its own approach in the interim, but the desire is to bring that data on in and make the informed decision down the track.
So
Is it possible that, and we're talking here about, I don't even know what the numbers mean, we're talking here about the 8.5 of the, is it possible that it is possible that different councils could have different models because your susceptibility, the risk is greater? For example, if you've got a large coastal area, your risk might be higher than if you're in Queenstown. So it might be perfectly natural that somebody could be 0.5, somebody else could be 4.5, because the risk factor is different for them, even if the overall scientific is accepted. Is that true?
Yes, so it could be helpful to ask members of the working group down the back how different councils are doing it presently. But certainly, there are a range of different scenarios. There's common practice to look at more than one scenario when you're trying to do your modelling to get a sense of what the span might be of impacts. And then there has to be a decision made as to what level of risk the community and the individual council is willing to accept. So I don't know if you want to offer up
But sorry, just to come back to that, because I'm trying to understand how it works. It's not only a matter of the risk which they are prepared to accept, it's also the risk to which they are susceptible, that their community is susceptible. Because so if you live in a floodplain and you're rivers and you're on the coast, your risk might be higher than someplace else. So it's not just a matter of choosing what risk, it's a matter of the actual risk may be different.
I think your point is very valid, and I would speak to examples from my own experience where we've been managing risk in a deployed operational military setting, and you can have two parties and experiencing exactly the same threat, but accepting risk to different levels, and some therefore need or make a decision to invest more heavily in risk mitigation, where others will invest to a less degree in mitigation, accepting that that the what is at stake is slightly different for both parties, even though it's the same threat environment they're functioning in. So I think it's entirely valid that ultimately, when it comes to a specific or a local issue, maybe around adaptation, there could be two entities that do adopt a slightly different orientation, a risk orientation or threat orientation to what climate change is presenting them with.
I wasn't suggesting that we might be different. I think that we should all be the same, but I think you should look around nationally, because the national government, at least the previous government, gave guidance about what level are in the 8.5, right? This government may change that. We don't know. But even if they do, we still need to think about the risk in our particular area rather than as it relates to the average national position.
Yeah, I think that's entirely valid.
One of our detailed principles of understand risks and look for potential ways to avoid, mitigate, and manage risk. That's essentially, that is one of the principles of understanding. So SDC's done coastal inundation report for coastal areas and presented the report around those risks based on the different thresholds of what RCP level you're using. So it's the understanding of the different thresholds of risk it's not necessarily saying this is the risk that decisions are going to be based on or planning is going to be made on. The understanding is presenting those different risk thresholds first, and as long as that's kind of got that level of transparency, then it does allow each topic of discussion around risks to be approached almost case by case, because it's allowing the understanding that, you know, you can look at worst case scenario, medium scenario, not so bad scenario, and does there necessarily need to be a uniform, always go with worst case scenario, as long as all risks are being understood. That is the detailed principle of the strategy.
And I suspect that what we're dipping into is this conversation that is yet to occur as we understand or pursue that aspiration relating to achieving a degree of alignment around the scenarios that we think are appropriate for Southland.
And ultimately, the risks may not be up to us to determine. It's up to, you know, strategically to understand those risks. It may be the community themselves, or you know, if it's policy makers, or whether it's the private sector, insurance, whoever. It's really going to be from understanding the risks. The actual outcomes of what you do about those risks may not, you know, be in the hands of local council.
Keith, you're wanting to comment?
I just want to go back to something that Dean mentioned, and that's in terms of the gaps we've got in the science. We've got limited resources available to us. I wouldn't like to see us spending too much time in actually looking at the gaps. I think acknowledgement of the gaps is probably a more effective way of dealing with it, rather than us as a combined group actually trying to zoom in or break down, do any research, etc. I don't see that as our role. I think we rely on the information we've got available to us and focus on moving forward. And in that context, yeah, coming back to risks, you know, what risks do we face? That is an important component of phase 2. And we have many of our councils, well, in the case of Invercargill, Southland shared rivers, Southland Gore, we share rivers, and so the need for an integrated approach is significant. But at the same time, it's just not the amount of water that's coming down in the rivers, it's the amount of water that's falling out of the sky that Gore struggles with at times, the inability to cope. So I see an important part really of phase 2 of identifying what the risks are, almost in a spatial planning type of way, and acknowledging the integration that we've got of those risks across the region. Southland and Invercargill, coastal, Gore, not so. That will actually, in terms of implementation, narrow down the areas that each of the council will need to look at. And we don't have to have the same approach in every council, but we need to have an integrated approach.
So just casting our mind then to those range of themes that emerged that we've listed under that heading, and then thinking through these bullet points on the whiteboard. Are there particular actions that we need to take in respect of what we're currently calling the proposed climate change strategy? Are there adaptations that we need to make to that strategy? Specific actions or refinements?
I've got one thought of something that maybe the strategy doesn't take into account based on some of these, particularly the support and opposition to modelling, that conversation around net zero, what can be done locally versus what can be done nationally versus what can be done globally, and what is the role within the strategy as far as advocacy for this local area in terms of the national discussion of net zero. Our strategy identifies that we're roughly 10% of emissions. Rebecca McLeod cited something along the lines of Fiordland being potentially 20% of sequestration. So where does that leave our local area as far as net zero targets? And where does that leave us as far as advocacy to the national conversation of where do we need to be to align with that? And if because of our contribution to GDP, we put up a lot of emissions, but also geographically we've got a large area of sequestration, are those things taken into account? And I think that's some of the challenges on the modelling as far as net zero. There was a little bit, there's that whole argument of, well, what if Southland does this, but what's happening in other larger countries? You could take a national approach to that too and go, well, are we as a region doing what we can, but also being credited to the other factors around the area, such as other areas of sequestration that maybe isn't then being accredited to our own.
So that issue then of pursuing advocacy or promoting advocacy on behalf of the region when engaging at a national level, I'm just casting my mind, does that connect with a particular existing aspiration that they've identified?
Not that I
I'm not sure if you talk, it's exactly that, but if you think about the question of the accounting for methane, for example, which is absolutely critical importance to farmers and therefore to Southland as a whole. Now that is arguable. There is no certain science in that. It's more of a political matter actually than a scientific matter. And we should, I think, as a province, we should be thinking about how we advocate in that respect. But I don't think it forms part of does not form part of the strategy. We should perhaps mention it in the strategy as this, does not mean that we don't advocate. I don't want to try to wordsmith it, but I mean, we would advocate, I think, for some of these things, but it does not form part of the strategy, because otherwise you just end up down rabbit holes.
Probably not in terms of aspiration, but in terms of principles, I guess it would fall into alignment and just ensuring balanced decision making. I guess what I'm alluding to is the balanced decision making on a national scale. So we've got support for a collaborative approach for what we do here. As far as monitoring going forward, how is the strategy working? It's understanding how is it performing on a national scale, and that will take, that's not something that can just be determined down here. That needs to kind of understand, well, how does this work on a national level? How are we performing in our net zero aspirations? And based on the principle of alignment with the national scope of things, that probably needs a bit more clarity, more so once the strategy's underway in terms of monitoring actually how it is going and whether we are meeting those aspirations.
So I guess what emerges for me is the question, is that something that would be appropriate to perhaps carry forward to the framework for action?
Yeah.
As an element of that framework for action, as flagging how will advocacy be managed at a regional level?
So regional advocacy should be a dot point in that. We just got to watch it. It doesn't deflect the whole thing. It's a kind of get off the hook thing by starting to debate how the impact of methane or the effect of fjordland or whatever. I mean, that is the intention of the thing. But regional advocacy is still necessary because there is a kind of game of winners and losers on this nationally.
Keith, you had a comment?
How our aspirations are achieved, one of the techniques is advocacy. So I see it clearly as an implementation as phase 2 rather than as part of this. I'd be hesitant for us to be seen to be promoting things like sequestration in Fiordland without actually fully understanding the implications of it to the need to protect the values that we have there. What are the environmental effects of actually undertaking the sequestration? not only in Fiordland but in coastal areas as well. And until I see we have a role to respond to things rather than to take a lead.
That seems sensible. So Matt, I mean, in response then, do you think it is appropriate that we flag that as something to carry forward to the framework for action, that the potential for advocacy?
Yeah, I mean, the only I do into the framework as far as the current phase 1 strategy and aspirations, maybe number 7, it's covered under councils understand their role in leading Murihiku Southland to become a net zero region. It's that understanding their role includes advocacy, it includes reacting to national policy statement and all of those things to ensure that we're doing what needs to be done locally, but also in the national sense of things, it's an equitable outcome for the region and not letting, putting due pressure on this region nationally when other areas might kind of not be held to the same account.
I wonder, I agree with the way you've interpreted 7, but I wonder whether in fact it needs to be wider than just more than referring to net zero.
So you mean in respect of adaptation as well?
Yes,
yeah.
Yes.
Well, there's two kinds of advocacy, isn't there? There's advocacy with respect to accounting and so forth, but there's also advocacy in terms of funding for adaptation, isn't there? You know, trying to get our share of whatever the public purse might be. But I actually liked where you were heading there with that paragraph. I think the paragraph is the right paragraph. It would be very easy to insert the word advocacy in there at some point, to just allow that as a. Read the paragraph again.
It's 7, so it's in mitigation 7. Councils understand their role in leading Murihiku Southland to become a net zero region by 2050. It's quite specific. The other one in adaptation being 10 of we collaborate to create regional pathways for action, acknowledging the interconnectedness of specific issues. I guess I'm just saying in both of those cases, it's also not just regionally focused, it's what do we need to do here and how does that fit into the bigger picture.
Both of those paragraphs would be fairly easy to slip the word advocacy in just to cover it so that it's we have dealt with it at least in the, but it mainly comes in the action plan.
Yeah, but I think I agree, Matt, that those are the two aspirations where advocacy would connect 7 and 10 together. To me, makes sense. Or indeed, if you wanted to take it up one level, it's probably an aspiration number 3, in terms of acting courageously, building resilience to respond and thrive. You could potentially speak to advocacy.
Yeah, that's probably a better place for
that one, in which case it would respond to both mitigation and adaptation and community engagement.
Advocacy is a big thing in any work program, I think, and action plan, framework for action.
Yeah, and so then the question is, do we put add advocacy to a specific aspiration, or do we add it to the text which introduces those overarching aspirations? This is page 15 of the.
I think it's overarching, isn't it? Yeah, I think so.
In the overarching aspirations is in the preamble, there's a bit of a thing of ongoing cross-agency discussions will help develop and align pathways. I guess overall the point I'm trying to make is that this will, and if it's in the framework for action, it will go beyond just cross-agency discussions. There's going to be wider stakeholder discussions that we've already acknowledged, but it's also playing that regional discussion as part of a national discussion, as part of a global discussion. If that is one of the aspirations of, this working group, this strategy, this work stream.
And if you look at the second to last paragraph under the overarching aspirations, it refers to local government agencies to support effective responses you could almost put in there to support and advocate for effective responses.
Seems kind of sensible and an efficient way of responding.
Right, I mean, you can hear for those farmers who came to speak to us, and we had at least 2 individual farmers came to speak to us. I mean, there is actually a kind of plea for help coming from them, isn't there? And I think it is appropriate, you know, that their advocacy, to the extent that it's given by anybody, well, we as the councillors for Southland have a role in that. So I think it's right that it's mentioned.
So that seems like perhaps a small addition in the edit to take forward.
Yep.
Quickly checking. Yep. So before we move on to the next set of things, I just want to make sure that this, because there was a lot of themes that were bundled under this broad heading around, you know, to what degree do we sense that we've got a mandate for progressing the strategy as well as continuing to act collaboratively. Are there any other issues that emerge under this set of themes? Because this actually is a bulky chunk of the themes that we identified. And again, it may be that as we continue through our discussion on the subsequent ones, that we could potentially have to circle back, but I just flagged it as a potential outcome.
Bullet points 2 and 3, sometimes I think they cancel each other out. So you really want science, and then there's people saying to you, the science we've got's not necessarily, it's outdated a bit and stuff like that. What I generally heard was we want science to back what we're doing. So not sure whether you know, there was some views, and there wasn't too many views that it was the mistrust of the science. I think you've got what science we've got. A lot of it's come from a high level, and I sort of acknowledge that we do as iwi that climate has changed over years, and it will continue to change up and down. You'll have your ice ages, you'll have your hot periods, and all that sort of stuff. So, our discussion is around human induced climate change. So, and the third one is we as iwi, and we think whatever you've all got to do your bit, and I'm not sure that we should really worry too much about that. We as Southlands have to do something for a global. We're all part of that global influence, so we've just got to do our bit. And in terms of the percentage scale, it might not look like much, but we're still, we're part of a bigger, broader world, and we just need to do our bit. And probably don't agree with that. Climate change is in Southland's not going to make any difference to climate change globally. Whatever you do, I think it will. And it might even be in the smallest bit.
So taking all of those ideas and do you sense that the strategy as it's currently structured is on target or reflects those needs?
Yeah, I just think some of those ones, you know, the statements, and I'm not sure they're probably captured, you know, where people recognise this climate change over millions of years, and it will always be. Yep, so sort of like, do we really need to hold on to that? Or do anything about that? I don't think so. And don't think we need to hold on to not doing anything, because it's globally it's not going to be measurable, maybe, you know, but we know if we do something in our own right, we want people to do stuff in their own homes, and we want people to do it in their own communities, and Southlanders to help the New Zealand response. New Zealand does stuff, might be a hell of a small percentage, but at least it's us doing something as our responsibility as New Zealanders.
And I guess during the presentations, occasionally, if it was raised that, you know, mitigation won't make much difference to us in Southland, my mind would often go to some of the low-lying Pacific Islands that I've visited and appreciate just how vulnerable they are. Maybe it's not this community that will benefit from some of those investments and mitigation. It's going to be others in other more vulnerable parts of the globe that may be the beneficiaries of that. The next slide was really around support for that collaborative approach being taken. I just wanted to, we're going to break for a coffee break shortly, but on this particular topic, I think we got a pretty strong message from the public consultation.
Absolutely.
We did, but there was also a clear message coming through from a number of the organisations who made presentations that they would like to be part of it moving forward as well. And I think that's an important thing to pick up at the meeting we got later this week.
So a call to be more inclusive and involve other stakeholders, a wider group of stakeholders in conversations going forward.
And I think that's important because in looking at adaptation and in terms of what the councils do collectively and individually is going to impact on the wider community and on these groups, either physically or as an interest group.
Mm. Do you think, therefore, is there a need to make some edit to the existing strategy, or is this an issue that we take forward as to our work as we start developing the framework for action?
I think we'd confuse it a little bit if we added something at this point. It is phase 2, and I think what's in the strategy clearly sets out that we'll be rethinking.
Yeah. Others comfortable that that's an issue for our phase 2 work to consider what are the mechanisms we can involve a wider set of stakeholders in the conversation?
It's included in number 11 of building a regional community of learning and collectively improving understanding.
I agree with the principle. The practice, I'm not so sure of, but I mean, we'll come to that at the next stage. If you list the number of organisations who reasonably might expect to be involved in such a thing, including, say, the Forward and Nucka, and I mean, if you include everybody who might reasonably involve, you'd probably have 50 people in this room, and nothing would get done. So there is actually, that's why you get elected members rather than everybody coming to council, because you got to have a small enough people that practically you can make decisions. So it's difficult to disagree with principle, but I think we need to take a practical view of the best way of moving things forward and whether that would be possible with a very large community involved. And how do you exclude people if you decide to be selective?
Yeah.
Tom, I think of the presentation we had from Health Department where they were seeking to come along and actually give us a presentation, and that may actually be the appropriate way of doing it.
Involvement.
Yeah.
So I'm here. I'm thinking we're kind of in agreement that we do have that mandate for continuing the collaborative approach, and that as we progress phase 2 work, we'll be looking at the different ways to engage with and include other stakeholders. No need to edit or change the existing strategy as a result of that. And it will be progressed as we move into phase 2, the framework for action. And it may be via different means. For instance, as I say, it could be a presentation from a stakeholder like Whataora, or maybe there's an opportunity for a hui where we engage farming community to build awareness of risk in a particular area or industry. I imagine there's a range of options we could consider as appropriate to progress that.
And part will depend on the type of document that we're heading towards as to whether it's going to be an options document or giving some firmer direction on where we see it going. And if it's the latter, then it would be appropriate to have a meeting of the larger groups to get some feedback or provided by other means. If it's an options document, then it'll be a slightly different approach. So I think part of the discussions we need to have early in phase 2 is what's the outcome that we're seeking to achieve.
And that's a conversation we might look forward to on Thursday, when we next convene for our next working group meeting. It's got to a point where we are scheduled, happily, to have a 10-minute coffee break and a leg stretch, perhaps just so that people go to that coffee break with a sense for what follows. The one we will be considering when we return is recommendations in respect of the strategy principles. So we're going to have a 10-minute coffee break. So thank you very much, everyone. We're back at past. Thank you. So we've got the sound back on for the live stream recording, and so thank you for everyone for being back on time. Oh, we've got one to come. Might just wait a moment. Thank you. So reconvening, under this particular heading of, were there any recommendations that emerged in respect of the strategy's principles? And there was one, and I believe from memory, this emerged from the presentation from Whata Ora of New Zealand Health, who pointed out or noted that as climate change or a changing climate starts to impact, the effects on members of a society is unlikely to be equally felt, equally experienced. Some will be able to respond and adapt more easily than others. And so they suggested that the consideration of equity is required. And as I was reflecting on this one, I was wondering do our existing set of principles respond to this need in terms of how it guides us? Or rather, should this be one that consideration of equity is explicitly introduced or stated somewhere in the existing strategy? Kind of keen for thoughts on this one.
I think it'd be well worth putting in, actually. But I mean, when I reflected on that, I thought the single biggest move that's been made by Southland so far in this respect would be the decision by all of us, but particularly Environment Southland, that flood defence and so forth would be rated on a Southland basis rather than each year's doing their own thing. I think the impact of that is that is an equity move. That means a small village, Gore for that matter, not a small village, but Gore is not going to have to fund all of the flooding risk. It's going to be, we are going to actually have that spread across Southland. So I think that was a significant equity decision that has already been taken. But whether the word is worth adding to the document, I would agree that it is a good idea, actually.
So you would advocate that we probably should at least.
I think it's a good idea just to remind ourselves of that need.
Yeah, and other thoughts? Sorry.
I think equity is a real big one, especially in terms of health and wellbeing, whether it sits in a strategy, but it definitely must sit in terms of framework for action. There are some communities that might be a little bit poor and might not have an ability to uplift themselves and retreat and these sorts of things. So,
I'd be keen to see something explicit put in there when I look at kaitiakitanga. The third bullet point refers to value of wellbeing and livelihoods for and future generations, which you could say also implies an equity component to it. But I'd actually favour something that was more explicit and gives us a lead for the next phase of because I imagine the next phase that we're going to take these detailed principles and actually work through each one of them. And if we've got one there specifically referring to equity, then I think it will be helpful.
I thought we have it. It might not be covered enough, but in it's a Tanga inclusivity. Because I was going to add also not only equity, but the transparency element was raised as well. And this one has transparent sharing of knowledge for a fair and equitable transition towards our future. So it is in the principles, in the detailed principles, it does just say create a fair transition to our future. So reinstating that and equitable transition. That I don't know whether that goes far enough, but it is in there. I think during the discussions around principles in the first place, there was quite in-depth conversation around equity, and that's how that got in there. Maybe it isn't quite strong enough for the submission.
I think we have to be very careful of how we use the word equity. Equity does not mean the same outcome. So in other words, if you have a very small community which is, surrounded by a river that's likely to flood, you cannot, spend an absolute fortune just protecting that river. It might be that you have to retreat, for example. So equity doesn't mean the same outcome. And you just have to be careful that you don't include the word in such a way that it would be used against us at some future point. Where somebody said, wait a minute, I thought we were all, if you defend an avocado, you should defend my little hamlet.
Yeah, and I do recall that I think we did go around the buoy a few times on whether equity, or as we've used it within the principle of katahitanga inclusivity, the third bullet point is create a fair transition to our future. And I think you're right that I think originally there was equity was in the mix there somewhere, wasn't it?
So it's on the tree diagram.
Yeah.
It does include equitable, but then on the
Right.
detail, it should may have been updated in that part.
So my sense is that that is in there, and maybe so the question is, do we want to give it a greater emphasis within the strategy than is currently reflected?
I probably like the word fairness better, actually.
Yeah. Of course, the other way to respond to this is to, as we move into the phase 2 work, is to carry this forward as a consideration as we're casting our eye over different initiatives or projects that emerge, understanding that that's one of the lenses to evaluate whether something does represent a fair or equitable outcome for stakeholders.
Yeah, fair and equitable means different things, doesn't it? Really, equitable means the same. Basically, fair means, fair in the sense that it may be different, but it's fair. So
equality.
It's not quite the same meaning. Anyway, I think it should be in there. I think we should just be very careful that how we write it does not imply that everything is going to have the same outcome.
So if we were to give it greater emphasis within the strategy, where do people think might be the appropriate place to give that emphasis? We've touched upon it to a degree within one of the principles, katahitanga. It's not explicitly stated as within any of the aspirations.
Just one of that fits well there, but it's bringing it into a framework of action that we really deal with there, because it, my mind, equity has always been about you might get someone up to get to it. You might have to put more effort into a particular space than someone else to get everyone up to equal levels. So you might need an extra effort and for a particular group. So that's a fair bit of forward thinking that would need to happen in terms of framework for action. Just having the wording fair in there gives us a little bit of a foundation to bring it through into framework for action.
Carry forward to the framework for action.
Just my whakaaro.
Any thoughts, Keith, or with you pondering?
Yeah, now that I see that, fair and equitable is dealt with the tree diagram, that does give a lead in, and whether there should be something in more detailed principles and create a fair transition to our future. Is that enough? And given that fair is both in the tree and in the detailed, I'd actually like to see equitable carried over to the more detailed one as well.
So just align that final bullet point with what's stated in the tree diagram above.
Yeah.
Again, it's an efficient edit that would respond to that suggestion, as well as then taking it forward to our framework for action work and analysis is an important principle.
So what are you proposing for the third dot point?
So if you look at the kotahitanga
Yeah.
inclusivity statement, as it reads in the tree diagram,
Yeah.
what we're suggesting is simply to take that fair and equitable transition towards that future, is to carry that wording down into the detailed one, to create a fair and equitable transition to our future.
Through you, Chair, we could, in response to Councillor Campbell's concerns, have a footnote around the difference between equality and equity, potentially, if it was something you were interested in doing.
I mean, we want to be unequitable, I don't mean it laughing, but clearly, again, the cost of defending a tiny little army language is unaffordable, and you don't want somebody saying, wait a minute, this is inequitable. You defended Invercargill, you know. So I mean, I think we need to rate. So I maybe your approach is the best one. I definitely like the word fair rather than.
Now, just flag, just as a process, maybe just pause and express that Anchor's busy taking notes for us, and the intention is likely to be, and we'll take stock of this towards the end of today's work, is to provide these edits to the report and then share them back, and perhaps just have a final, maybe virtual meeting to agree on the final form of that strategy before we take it forward to each council to endorse. So I just want to flag that as the likely pathway forward. But again, we'll reserve that discussion till the end of deliberations today, once we take stock of the full degree of change that has emerged for the strategy, because there may yet be some significant change that requires a little bit more public consultation before we endorse it. But we'll track that and see how it emerges during the rest of the discussion today. As people reflect on the public submissions and the presentations we benefited from, were there any other recommendations or things that emerged that might warrant reviewing any of the principles that we had identified? We received relatively little specific feedback on the principles throughout the submissions.
One that I haven't checked came from Don Nicholson, where he talked about the need for a precautionary principle approach. I'm just wondering if we've actually picked up on that in either the aspirations or
Can you perhaps just expand on how you would perhaps explain that precautionary approach? What you think you were hearing from?
Yeah, and it was in relation to adaptation, and it's back, I guess, to the perennial discussion about cautious versus precautionary, and I see it as quite a valid issue, that it is the precautionary approach that we should be using, and I guess it comes back also to the way the priorities are ranked. We're not there to save or to protect everything. And I guess it comes back to Tom's comment about equity as well. I probably need to sit down and just do a word search on the document. Does precautionary come up at all in the document?
I think that certainly one of the aspects or features of the forward speaks to the fact that we are dealing in a space of uncertainty in terms of understanding what the impacts are likely to be. Just quickly looking through to, because in my mind, acknowledging the uncertainty suggests that it's appropriate to adopt the precautionary orientation.
I think under the principle of guardianship, we could well add a dot point that says that we would take a precautionary approach. But it's a really important point. I'm not sure that's actually what Don meant. I took it meaning the other way, exactly the other way. But the point that we are not absolutely certain. We've already covered this ground actually. We're not absolutely certain of the size. It's not a law of nature. It's a hypothesis. So we're not absolutely certain, but we're taking a precautionary approach. I think that would be probably set well under guardianship actually.
So taking that idea forward, do you think that the third bullet point under the detailed principle kaitiakitanga guardianship, do you think that third bullet point might be expanded a little to capture that need? Valuing the well-being and livelihoods of our present and future generations by adopting a precautionary.
Well, actually, the second dot point might even be better. We're saying we create a balanced framework which supports many interconnected strands while always taking a precautionary principle approach.
You're itching to say something?
What are we being precaution about the approach? I'm cautious about making framework without.
I think there's a number of layers to being cautious, to being cautionary. One is to make sure that the best set of knowledge is available to you before you make a significant investment. That could be one way of looking at it, but maybe also another way of looking at it is, not delaying action where there's a risk that may emerge at a more rapid rate, making sure that you don't lose freedom of action by not acting at appropriate timelines. Or
So I feel we're talking about being proactive. We're talking about being balanced, understanding things. The only detailed principle that I'm a little wondering whether it speaks against precautionary is the pursue an iterative management approach. So pursue iterative management, adapting our approach as we learn and know better. Is there potential that could be perceived as not a precautionary approach, but more or less by just full steam ahead approach as it comes up?
Can you just clarify where you're reading that? Which principle is that under?
Under Mahiotanga understanding. So the second bullet point and the detailed principles. Pursue
iterative management, adapting our approach as we learn and know better.
So that almost suggests a non-precautionary approach. Precautionary in terms of get on and do something, take a precaution, but maybe not precautionary as in understand what you're doing, just kind of get on with it. So
I actually
being precautious.
I actually interpret it the other way. A precautionary approach is making a decision on the basis of the information that you have, not on having 100% of the science. And to me, that bullet point is saying exactly that. We will change our approach as our knowledge improves. So we're making decisions on the basis of what we've got. So maybe a little bit of a rewording this is.
I'm probably aligning with your way of thinking about that when I reflect on the dynamic adaptive planning process workshops that we enjoyed that spoke to this need of being deliberately adaptive and iterative as you identify potential thresholds that are approaching, then being prepared to make decisions that reflect a change in your response to the climate threat.
Yeah, I just think precautionary, or is that getting stuff done from a good set of understandings, which is why I'm looking at Mahi Tahi and the second bullet point. Adopt united, integrated, consistent and holistic approach enabling informed and balanced decision making. It's, I get this whole idea of being cautious, but it's like, but you've got a good set of direction going forward. Yeah.
I think you're appropriate. That is an appropriate observation. I'd agree with that as well. I guess returning to the idea, do we want to where was it? There was two iterations going rewinding. Where was it that you was
Understanding.
understanding?
So
The second bullet point.
to iterative management. I guess that's the only one based on this precaution conversation that I wonder whether that particular bullet point is a bit open to interpretation of how iterative management could be presumed to be either precautious or not precautious.
Right.
So that would be the area that I personally.
Whereas I think there was another suggestion that under kaitiakitanga, the second bullet point, that it might be also an opportunity to reference the precautionary approach under that bullet point.
Probably under the understanding one, that second one of pursue iterative management, you can almost change those three words to adopting a precautionary approach, adapting our approach as we learn and know better.
It's clearer.
The reason I like under guardianship is because I think that is exactly the reason why we do take a precautionary approach, is because of guardianship accountability. I mean, I do think it fits better there, but I mean, you could actually, if you look at every single one of those, you could fit it in some place, but I actually do think it sits above that a little bit. And to me, even though these are not described as a hierarchy, they are actually in some respects, and the peak of the hierarchy is accountability for guardianship.
I think I probably would lean more towards your thoughts on that one, Keith, and that thinking that it probably would fit more appropriately under the principle of kaitiakitanga.
You could add a fourth dot point. You don't need to necessarily wordsmith either of the three.
Yeah. So we will suggest an inclusion of that, and we'll bring that one back with the edits amongst the that come back to the panel in due course.
To some extent, this is a response to a lot of the questions that we got. A lot of the points were made about sort of prove for us. When you say, well, we take a precautionary approach, I mean, I think it's a response to that actually.
So it almost warrants a separate standalone bullet point as a part of that principle, I think.
Yeah, I think that's probably fair, given that we heard a lot of different views and stuff like that. So, and they range right across the spectrum. So it's probably how it's worded.
So that would be around the importance of adopting a precautionary approach. Pursuit of kaitiakitanga. Before I move to the next heading or the next set of themes, just check, no other thoughts in respect of principles that people picked up or detected or read through the submissions and or Okay. So the next one was themes that connected with the idea of potential recommendations in respect of the aspirations that we had within the strategy. There was support with some recommending an earlier goal for Southland becoming a net zero region by 2050. Equally, there was opposition to Southland becoming a net zero region by 2050. And I guess within that, there was a broader set of opposition to the aspirations to generate regional climate change action, which kind of almost perhaps connects back to the original question of do we have a mandate to continue working in this space. I guess my question to the panel is, do we see a need to further amend or edit the aspirations that we've currently captured within the strategy?
We've got to go back a step and say, why were people opposing net zero by 2050? And it was in the context of CO2 emissions, where it was argued that, in fact, CO2 was not the key matter that we should be focusing on, and methane, yes. And when you look again at the regional document that was done last year in terms of perceptions, and in terms of the legislation that we've got, I think it's really, we don't have a choice. I think
Tom's point from earlier that this is possibly one where we don't have the luxury of not pursuing a net zero outcome.
Another thing that struck me, Chair, was somebody talked about the much earlier target which Dunedin had set. Now, I'm actually not familiar with it, but I would pretty much bet that that was the target for the City Council, as opposed to for the region. We're talking about a target for the southern region. Yeah, it's a totally different thing. That's a good point.
We've got the two different levels of it, the organisational net zero, which the entities have their goals to set and mitigation approaches to meet, and that based on baselines and future hitting those reductions targets can be measured. The regional net zero, again, could go back to that. Well, how do you measure it? So on a national, like, how do you measure when Murihiku has become a net zero? And that's going to take a lot of individuals and businesses and communities to do their part of it as well. So point 7 or aspiration 7 of councils understand their role in leading Murihiku Southland to become a net zero region by 2050. That's one of the harder aspirations to kind of nail down, because it's aspiring to understand what our role is, which is obviously very different to say we understand what the role is. It is easier to look at it within the organisation and meet those targets. So there needs to be a bit more guidance in order, as to Tom's point of, it's not actually up to us, it's guided to us of you must be kind of net zero. There needs to be a bit more guidance on, well, how do you measure the KPI of how we're performing in that? And that is for something that we do need to understand more. So we do need to aspire to understand more. And we need to know that fast before we can go into a framework for action. That the opposition to Southland becoming a net zero region by 2050, well, and then there's support for becoming a net zero region. Well, we're seeing that support already enacted in the private sector by their own net zero targets, by individuals from their own targets. Opposition, they may, be left in the minority of not adapting to net zero targets, and whether opposition is then brought along with just the natural cost of emissions and the cost of carbon going up. It's kind of beyond council's control or even policy control at a local level. So I'm still a little bit kind of concerned about aspiration 7 and a bit of ambiguity around councils understand their role in leading. Do councils understand the role? Yes, in terms of organisational net zero. Until we have a framework for action, I don't know if 7 can really come to fruition, and it's hard to know how a framework for action would be without actually understanding, well, what is council's role going to be in that framework for action? Is it at a leadership and communication and advocacy, or is it going to be at policy? And I think there was a lot of opposition based on the assumption of how councils are going to help implement a net zero region versus what our aspiration is of actually just, showing a leadership role. So is it leadership or is it forced through policy and change? It's still a little bit up in the air.
And I think, in my mind, reflecting that this is a stated aspiration, that we're not necessarily there now. Today, you might argue we are yet to develop an understanding of what our role is. This is one that we do need to invest some attention in over time moving forward. And I would imagine this could play out in a whole number of ways, and it could play out differently for different councils. Potentially, if it was around making it easier to install large solar power installations for industry, do our current regulation and policy settings get in the way of that? Could we make it easier by adjusting some of our policy settings either at an environmental level or at a district or city council level, for example? I would imagine there's different things that might yet emerge in terms of what is that we can do to support net zero.
It's where I'd challenge it, I guess, to add. I think the concern that led to some opposition is that assumption of leading means to enforce, and potentially leading, adding, and enabling, because it may be in some cases to actually get out of the way to allow the community itself to reach their net zero ambitions. So there is a leadership role, but there's also just enable those who already are to also to get on with it. And I guess concern of if it is the assumption of it's up to councils to lead it, does that then take pressure off individuals and communities to take their own leadership as well? So I'd like to see, maybe based on the fact that there is support and opposition, that councils understanding their role in leading is also councils just understanding their role of just enabling by letting the.
It would be, you're suggesting an edit that would read, councils understand their role in leading and or enabling?
Yep.
Murihiku Southland to become a net zero region by 2050.
Yeah, I agree. I'm not quite sure how we worked it, but I actually agree with the point that's been made. I mean, we I think, absolutely are going to lead the adaptation work. When it comes to mitigation, are we going to be interested bystanders, supportive bystanders to government action, or are we going to have some kind of independent role ourselves in driving that? I don't know the answer to that. So I think the point that's made is probably a good one. Are we actually going to be leading that? I'm not uncomfortable leaving the word there, if I'm honest, but I definitely take the point. We might be nothing other than interested bystanders as this progresses. But adaptation, 100%, we're going to lead it.
Any additional thoughts on this one? So what I'm hearing then is a suggestion for a minor edit to aspiration number 7 to reflect that. Again, and it may be driven as much by the differences between mitigation and adaptation initiatives moving forward. So it would read, councils understand their role in leading and or enabling Murihiku Southland to become a net zero region by 2050.
The word enabling could replace leading, definitely fine.
Yep.
I mean, enabling can incorporate leading, you know.
Yeah, that's a good point. So it would be simply replacing the word leading with enabling.
Yeah, I think that's a more realistic word, actually.
Any other thoughts on aspirations that need adjustment or additional aspirations potentially, or aspirations that would need to be removed based on anything we heard through the public hearing submission process?
I'm not too sure where it came from, but one of the notes I wrote down was that aspirations should be measurable. And I thought, with a planning background, your objectives, you always want to have them so that are you being successful? Is today the day to have a discussion about how we actually measure whether we're making progress, or is that for the next phase?
Good question. In my mind, I think it is a topic that we carry forward into phase 2 of the work as we start now to consider the different options to realise these aspirations, and acknowledging that there may be different ways, different pathways to each aspiration, and that we haven't yet chosen which of those what those pathways are. That I would imagine there could potentially be different metrics that accompany different pathways, or a different mix of metrics that accompany different pathways.
I agree with what you're saying, and I think in what we send out to people, if that can be noted.
So it would be, I guess, so that's a note for the written response back to submitters.
Yeah.
That is our intention as we progress the development of the framework for action, that we would expect to identify appropriate metrics that would enable us to track progress towards these aspirations.
It's the monitoring chapter.
Does that seem like a sensible response? Concerns with that approach? Any other thoughts on aspirations?
I'm just interested in the Whatuora submission when they talked about 3 and 8 looking quite similar, whether that was worth considering.
It's linked to the idea of understanding.
We've seen the change, challenge, opportunities, social climate change, act courageously, building resilience, respond and thrive, and fully understand the risk and opportunities of our communities and social impact on our climate, change of climate, and itself.
Yes, yeah, you're right. 3 and 8 with a 2, and I think they suggested that maybe for aspiration number 3, it would be potential to simply delete the first part of that aspiration statement. So we will act courageously, building resilience to respond and thrive in the face of a changing climate. I guess the question emerges is, because the overarching one speaks to understanding both in the space of mitigation and adaptation, whereas aspiration 8 is adaptation specific.
Yeah.
And so in my mind, it's almost I think we almost want to preserve that sense of building understanding in both areas.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah.
Well, what that generates is back to our discussion before about cautious or precautionary. If we're going to fully understand, then that's a cautious approach. You can't understand until you've done all the science. We're going to make decisions on the basis of available information, not. I think that it probably would read better if it was just understand the risks, taking out the word fully.
Okay. So aspiration number 8 would be to remove the word fully, is what you're suggesting?
Yeah.
People feel about that slight amendment to aspiration number 8.
It's tautology anyway. The word understand and the word fully doesn't actually add anything to the 2 words.
That would probably is a totally get it. Any other thoughts on aspiration that might need changing? And I know that aspirations were one area of the strategy that we spent a lot of time with, and in the phase 1 work, certainly not thrown together lightly. Tested on a number of occasions by different councils and the working group itself.
I don't know if it needs to be included specifically, but the communications and engagement aspirations 11 to 13. Quite a few of the submissions were making comment on the level of transparency around the process, whether it's the transparency from the work already undertaken or the work going forward. It could be worth maybe in one of those, building a regional community of learning and collectively improving and understanding, kind of read between the lines would include a level of transparency. Just considering those submissions, whether, ensuring that anything that the framework for action presents into the future does have that kind of consultative and transparent approach could be reinforced through the aspirations, but it kind of also goes without saying.
So you're suggesting that it's actually aspiration number 11 that would be edited here with a reference to the need or the importance of transparency.
Yep. Even if it's we openly build a region community of learning, or
transparently build, or we build a regional community of learning promoting transparency as we collectively improve our understanding of the complexity of our changing climate.
Yeah, I'm not sure as far as wording. I just recall the amount of transparency came up and think that somewhere in communications and engagement, a reference to the commitment to progress transparently should be included somewhere. Even if it's in the the preamble to the.
Yeah, I probably agree. That was mentioned a few, but so to have it in there would be quite valuable. Very transparency.
Yep. Anka, did you capture that suggestion of we build a regional community of learning promoting transparency as we collectively improve our understanding of it? Yep. Thank you. Okay, since we're kind of getting diminishing returns on discussion of changes to aspirations, but if there is any further or final thoughts on that particular heading. The next one, this is things that were raised in the public submissions and in the presentations that we think it was kind of this responding to this issue of people saying there's not enough there for us to take forward in terms of action. And we always knew that there was a framework for action to follow as phase 2 of this work. There's the other part of it was the concern about the cost to ratepayers of regional climate action. In some respects, people might have been anticipating what might emerge in the framework of action because our strategy does, at this stage, does not indicate what specific actions or investments might occur in response to those aspirations. So there's probably a few suggestions or recommendations that came through that we could probably start to take inventory of, take stock of, that we might want to carry forward into our framework for action development. So what are people's thoughts on some of the big ones or ones that stood out for them in that respect?
So I'm going to ask the question again, and I haven't quite understood it. Ask me the question again.
Amongst the submissions and the people who presented at the public hearings, were there suggestions that we think are appropriate to take forward to the framework for action?
Well, I think when we're doing the framework for action, both the points there I agree with and we will be taking into account. I don't know if we can preempt what is going into that framework at this stage.
We might have already touched upon it. One that resonates for me is that call for inclusivity of including stakeholders as we start to work through this framework for action.
Yeah, I've got that written down here. Even if in the diagram of framework for action and the regional alignment, including a wider stakeholder box. So we've got collaborative projects, we've got 4 councils, but we don't have Te Ao Marama or extended stakeholders within that framework for action. And some of those comments from submitters, again, in that transparency part of things, concern that this has been kind of a little meeting of just these entities and it's already made up the mind of what's going forward, and it's just not the case. So proving that the framework for action is a wider scope could be worthwhile.
So there's two possible ways, or 2 complementary ways, maybe adding in a comment in that diagram, adding in a comment to the text that accompanies that diagram, noting that there's an intention to engage with a wider set of stakeholders as we develop the framework for action, and then potentially in the diagram itself adding in perhaps that there are regional stakeholders that need to be included, and we could use that generic term, regional stakeholders, a variety of regional stakeholders that would influence or have input to that framework of action development.
I think just to note that iwi have been involved in that partnership level work as we are with across the council. So when you mention it like that we'll continue to engage as at that partnership level when the framework for action continues.
As to that first bullet point, I mean, I personally struggled a bit with this, and even advocating for the work done at the SDC council table. I did, when there was comment around, can you call this document a strategy, and try to say, well, this is a strategy phase 1. It's the strategy of how to go into a strategy. And I'm not a linguist, but I kind of wonder whether we've got the word strategy and framework around the wrong way. And it's almost phase 1 is the framework for a regional strategy, and then the next phase is the strategy for action. And so the comments of that the strategy is not enough, it doesn't have action plans, is that assumption that a strategy would go, here's what we're going to do about it. Whereas what we have delivered is a framework on how we're going to approach creating a strategy. So again, it's semantics, but I can understand.
I don't know that it's only semantics. I do actually like the word strategy and action plan. I do like that. And there is a clear distinction. I mean, the reason you do them separately is, the old Alice in Wonderland story of person turning up at Alice turning up at the road junction, and it's Tweedledum and Tweedledee are there, and she asks them which direction to take, and they say, well, where do you want to go? And Alice says, I don't know. And they say, well, in that case, any direction will take you there, right? I mean, the whole point of the first stage is so that you can define the direction, right? Then the next stage is a route map of how you're going to get there. I mean, you're right, semantically, you can call it anything you want. But I mean, I like the expression strategy and action plan.
I do recall that was for that very specific region that we did add the phase 1 addition to the title to make it obvious that there was more to follow. That this is there is phase 2 work. We'll join it, and you'll have a more complete progress regional climate change response.
So I just want to check that the framework for action is still going to be called the regional climate change strategy for Murihiku Southland phase 2 framework for action. Is that?
It's an action plan. I'm not sure why we call it framework for action, but it's the action plan, it's what we're going to do. Strategies, what we want to do, the action plan is what we're going to do.
I think for the time being, it will remain, we will call it the framework for action because that's what we've referenced in this strategy document. What will be interesting to see is as it emerges, as it takes shape, does that remain the appropriate title for it? And that might be reflected on what are the features of that framework for action. Does it morph or does it shift our understanding of what's the appropriate title to reflect the importance or influence of it?
The framework could then break down and actually natural hazards needs its own action plan, economic things needs its own action plan, and it would be different kind of stakeholders for different parts of the action plan. So I guess that's been my interpretation of the next steps of framework for action is then also going, well, how do you create action plans for this strategy? But yeah, I mean, I can just understand where that first bullet point has come from submissions, thinking that this is understanding that there is a phase 2 to come. But until that phase 2 is there isn't really a strategy with action points yet. So it's just a matter of getting on with it.
Other thoughts on issues that were identified that we'd want to certainly flag or not lose sight of as we move into the framework for action?
We're going to talk about the second dot point, which I think is a very important one. I think clearly there is not a limited resource, and we are going to move at a pace which is actually affordable. But I think it's fair to say that in the strategy document at the moment, there probably is nowhere that says that. So there is an implication of the strategy document, I think, that resources are limited. So there is an argument, I think, for putting in something about affordability, or cost effectiveness, or words like that. I mean, I think it's probably a principal part of, it may be under guardianship or something. I haven't really thought it through, but I think the dot point up there, I think, is an important point. Maybe, I'm not saying missed, we've just taken as understood, but it probably should be explicit in the document.
In my mind, it connects a little bit to the previous discussion on including a precautionary approach, because part of being precautionary is also being cautious about what are the economic impacts of initiatives and can we afford the cost of action and can we afford the cost of inaction. So I think it connects there, but also sense that there is an opportunity to be more of an explicit statement within the strategy that this is certainly going to be something that needs close consideration as a framework for action is developed and emerges, is understanding the costs, the benefits of any potential action. I'm just wondering if it is an additional paragraph added to the strategy, and as we discuss the framework for action that is due to follow, making that quite explicit within that section.
Aspiration number 3, which was that overarching one of understanding the changes, challenges, and opportunities associated. That could be where we reference the potential costs and benefits.
I was probably, and rather than adding it to one of the
just as
aspirations, I was probably going to add it at page 18, where we've got a page dedicated to creating a framework for action. If it would be something that is explicitly added at that point.
So it's interesting, the word cost is this financial cost, and there's a cost of not potentially doing anything, and you have a cyclone Gabrielle where we lost life and stuff like that. Of course, that we had to fix the infrastructure up is more than potentially what could be put under the front end. So two sort of ideas around cost. A lot of us think it's a financial cost, but there's other costs that comes with it. So I think probably needs to be in there somewhere, but how? We definitely have to think about in terms of framework for action.
In my mind, perhaps on page 18 or around that area, as we talk about creating a framework for action, I think there's an opportunity perhaps to be more explicit about this particular need for a full understanding of the costs and opportunity costs to be woven into that framework for action development effort. Would people be comfortable if this is adjusted in this particular location? Or is that insufficient in and of itself?
I'm wondering whether, if I look at the principles in guardianship, and the third dot point in guardianship is we value the well-being and livelihoods of our present and future generations. Whether that word livelihood does not actually, if we make it so, actually capture that point.
So you're suggesting an edit to bullet point number 3 under?
No, what I'm not necessarily suggesting an edit. If we recognise that is included in that meaning, then maybe it's there already. Provided we have thought about it and can articulate it, that point, which is an important point, I think, is captured by that word livelihoods.
Tom, I'm just struggling a little bit to understand how. Are you suggesting a change to the?
Actually,
Or are you
suggesting that you leave it as it is, but that we just recognise, and it might be it's reflected in some other things that have been written, that we recognise that livelihoods incorporates the sense of recognising affordability, cost, and
because if you think of it wider, it's not just the financial cost, it's the social, economic and environmental impacts. And cost is just one of the components of that wider.
And I guess returning to the bullet point, with a number of people that speak to this particular issue is, can we afford, or to what degree can we afford, to invest in climate change, either mitigation and or adaptation?
they meant financial costs. We cannot beggar ourselves to do things that are just unaffordable.
Would people be comfortable if we attempted an addition to the framework for action page to a short paragraph to explicitly mention that we understand the need not to beggar ourselves? I don't have the words readily available, reflecting that there is a need for a balanced understanding of costs and of action and inaction. And it's not just economic, but there's also that it remains a strong determination of what isn't achievable.
I would support that. I think it sits right in a framework for action space because there's got to be a lot of work that needs to be done in that space.
It's almost there, but not quite there in terms of the second to last paragraph of the preamble. The resulting pathways will inform the setting of regional priorities as well as future long-term planning cycles. And I guess in my mind, long-term planning cycles does have a kind of financial cost to it. So it could be extrapolating that out as well as future long-term planning cycles, considering financial implications and benefits or something.
I think that is the place I would look to insert something a little bit more explicit on this particular topic. And I'm happy to work with staff to perhaps draft a suggestion on there.
Because essentially the LTP cycle is where costs would be.
Okay, now for something completely different. Right, so in terms of another aspiration or principle, several people spoke to nature-based solutions.
And the only place that nature-based solutions appears in the document is actually in the glossary. And interestingly as well, just given the discussion we had, it says there are solutions that are inspired and supported by nature and are cost effective and at the same time provide environmental, social and economic benefits. So I'm just wondering whether in fact we shouldn't be actually referring to nature-based solutions as potentially being not necessarily preferable, but a key component that's available for the options.
I think that wouldn't that be the framework for action, though, that you might have that as a, you know, an objective in the framework for action, that you choose those as a preference.
Accepted, yeah, potentially. I guess, yeah, the point I'm thinking about is that we want to have a green approach, not a concrete approach to solutions, as it were. Yeah, I accept what you're saying, Tom. I accept what you're saying. Yeah.
Actually, I think it's a bit copious to even to say that at this stage, because well, we may well prefer nature-based solutions. They may be inadequate.
Yep.
I do think it's probably an action plan matter.
Yep.
And we need to just think about what it means.
Yeah.
That's it's, you know.
Yeah. So again, in terms of what we heard from people, I think mirroring it back in terms of the responses that they're given, that we acknowledge it.
We acknowledge the utility of exploring those, and we will be looking to, as we do our framework for action work, carry that forward as one of the options to explore. Actions to explore.
It could potentially go into the double little asterisks on adaptation aspiration 10. We collaborate to create regional pathways for action, and then it says examples are carbon forestry, sustainable transport, potentially exploring nature-based solutions could go in there.
I like that.
Yep. So in addition to the footnote to aspiration 10, to acknowledge, include nature-based solutions, appropriate nature-based solutions. I still think it's worth perhaps flagging that it will be a consideration within our framework for action work. We've got time. Any other thoughts on suggestions or ideas or concerns that we need to specifically reflect as being carried forward for the framework for action?
Well, a matter that was raised several times, and it's not something that should appear in the strategy anywhere. No. So when you start to look at the framework for action, that whole question of gravel becomes important.
So question of
Gravel,
right.
it's not a matter for this, but when we come to the action plan, it's a pretty important matter. It was mentioned a number of times by some others.
So yeah, it's worth flagging that that's one that will be in some way attended to or considered within the framework for action.
That's what I mean in terms of feeding back to.
Yeah. Well, what I'm suggesting is perhaps maybe if it's board staff, as we do as we draft up the edits that are emerging from this discussion, as we do a scan back through the submissions just to make sure we haven't overlooked any specific suggestion or action that could have utility as we carry forward to the framework for action. I guess if you like a staff check. And I would kind of hope that the panel is open if we have missed anything or if there is a helpful suggestion from the staff and they would include that perhaps as an aspect in the draft that comes forward, that we'd be open to considering that correctly, constructively. To support that, would you
think that we would need to meet again to.
I think what is emerging, we haven't got much more yet to consider. We're on time. But I sense that what will happen from here is that, and we'll agree on this towards the end of today's meeting, it's likely that one option is take away the edits, add them to the proposed strategy, and maybe circle back for perhaps an online meeting for this panel to just take some time to review each edit and accept it as a panel before we lock in the changes. So in short answer, yes, but probably an online. Which brings us to 12:35, which was our scheduled lunch break. And we're scheduled to have a 30-minute break at this point. And if I could just go, you've already gone to the next slide. When we return from lunch, the final set of things that we want to look at is what's shown on the slide there, which is support and opposition to a broader engagement approach being taken, and any other themes that may
Is that the
emerge.
last slide?
That's the last slide in terms of.
Is there an option of working through that and breaking for lunch?
Could you just quickly, beyond that, then, sorry, I've got it in front of me. There's two more things to do after that, Tom. One was the level of proposed amendments to the strategy. Do we agreeing on whether we believe they represent a minor or a major set of changes? Because then that might influence what action is required moving forward. And then perhaps a closing session on capturing key messages. So I almost sense it is worthwhile pausing for around lunch break.
Yeah, no, I thought it was just that was the last slide, and I thought, well,
I might have to be away about 2, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, I understand that that's we need to maintain a quorum of 4 for this process. So half hour lunch break. Thank you. Brilliant, thank you everyone. So continuing after our lunch break, and we're making good progress. There's not a great deal left to attend to. The final heading was to consider other recommendations that may have emerged from the hearings and submissions. And so one of the ones that we've not noted here was support for, as well as opposition to, a broader engagement approach being taken. And in terms of support, there was quite a number of submitters who encouraged engaging a wider set of stakeholders and who actively requested to be part of that conversation, ranging from Whatu Ora, New Zealand Health, through to Federated Farmers, to even the researchers from Otago offered support. So that was one of them. And then there was an opportunity to reflect or consider any other themes that we may have missed in the discussion to date. Some of the key ideas that emerged in terms of opposition to a broader engagement approach was a sense that for some it creates unwanted anxiety to talk about the climate change challenge, and there's a sense that it was unhelpful to do so. So quite two varying perspectives on that. So again, keeping in mind as we think of these themes and the different approaches that we've got displayed on the whiteboard, you know, what is it? How might it be appropriate to respond to these particular points? Are there thoughts from the panel?
Actually, thought we'd already dealt with that one. At that point about the broader engagement, how we might approach that. We don't want 50 people in the room at the same time. We want to I mean, a submissions process, of course, is an engagement process. This is what we've just been doing the last couple of days. But I've said before that my view would be that you do not want a huge crowd trying to come to decisions. We want to hear their opinion, and build that in. But we just cannot run with a huge group of people trying to make decisions. It's ineffective. Even if you can, and of course we all do accept the principle.
Yeah. Does this suggest that in some respects a more targeted or nuanced engagement approach be considered, where we think or understand what value a stakeholder might bring to us, and we choose an engagement mechanism or methodology to engage with them that reflects both their needs and our needs. In some cases, it could be a briefing from Whata Ora, from their staff, because I think they offered that, for example. Or maybe it is including a set of stakeholders from the New Zealand ag or food and fibre sector at a hui kind of engagement. So tailoring our engagement so that we generate a two-way value flow in an appropriate way for the stakeholders who wish to talk with us. And if that is the case, that would probably be something we take forward into our framework for action around the communication and engagement aspirations.
And it will be dependent upon the amount of detail / direction that we want the next document to be. So until we've reached that point, don't know what the answer is.
Yeah. And perhaps to extend that a little further, maybe that engagement will help inform our thinking around what needs to be in that framework for action document, potentially.
Yeah, I guess the issue is how transparent do we be in our thinkings and in our ideas as we develop things? That's probably the key. Are we open 100% to our meetings in the same way this one is, versus being selective as to what we really release?
Becomes a joint committee, we'll have no choice.
Yes.
Like I quite like the your suggestion of having maybe different models for. I mean, the focus group type idea is a good way to getting people together who've got a common interest and trying to get from that some guidance for them. I mean, I think that would be useful.
A slightly different option is for where a stakeholder has submitted and requested to be involved. We could always ask them what would their preference be in terms of what would their engagement mode, would they prefer to be part of an observer at a working group meeting, or would they prefer to be able to come and brief the working group on a specific topic at a particular time? It could be an option to put that to them and get their preferences from them.
Well, again, if we become a joint committee, even if we don't, if we choose, you could have public. I mean, anybody can sit at the back, and if you choose to chair, you can ask them, invite them to speak if you wish.
And because there may be folk listening in who aren't familiar with what we're thinking on the potential for a joint committee, just to reiterate, at the moment we're developing a paper to take forward through the mayoral forum process, outlining the benefits and the pros and cons of either continuing with this mode of working or moving to a joint committee, or potentially even some other third option that we haven't considered. So that's being worked on at the moment and should be within a month or so available to take to the mayoral forum for further guidance. Of course, understanding there'd be a resourcing implication, potentially depending on which pathway you follow. Other themes that we may have overlooked or bypassed that we think it may be important to respond to. Themes that emerge from the hearing process, the public consultation process.
One that's spoken to by several was page 12 of the document, the Southern Regional Greenhouse Gas Emissions, and criticism that the work that was done by Great South was looking at gross emissions, not net emissions. And I think that's something that we do need to be responding to.
Do you think there's potential to perhaps add a little bit more explanatory detail to support what is currently included in the strategy document? Yes, I did wonder though, the table that's on the left-hand side that talked about total sequestration, is that the only credits, as it were, to the gross emissions to arrive at the net? Or were there other things that should be taken into account at arriving at the net figure? So this might be a good example of where we might need to get a little bit more information from from Great South, just to clarify some of these questions. And there was also doubt raised in terms of how the CO2 equivalent was identified, because I think there was talk about methane being transferred into that as well, though I didn't fully understand that.
Yeah, I mean, it mentions overall greenhouse gas emissions, and then it's described as CO2 equivalent. So I don't know.
Yeah, of course, it might be quite a simple answer to get that from the original report from which we extracted this information to share in this report. I guess the question is do people consider it helpful to retain this this information in the report at this point?
I think we should get it clarified, Chair. I think the numbers are correct as I've ever seen. I mean, I've seen these just daily before. But I think it is useful to have it in there because it calibrates people for. I don't know, I didn't understand the point about that was made, and I agree with it was made that it was a gross number rather than net. Clearly the net number is quoted. But there is an argument, I know that I've heard that, we don't count, for example, the grass that grows in Southland, would you? I mean, I've heard that argument, but that's because we don't get to choose how to calculate inventory. We use international standards for doing that, and that's what Great South have done here. And I'm pretty confident in the original report they outline what methodology they used to undertake those calculations. So no, I think we'll look to perhaps just clarify and maybe add some additional explanation as to either the basis for this or make sure it's really clear if people want to read further themselves how to go to that report to get it from the horse's mouth, so to speak. Will people be comfortable with that approach? But I'm hearing that the idea is we want to leave this in at this point. Yeah. And there will always be people who add it's inaccurate because methane does not survive in the atmosphere as long as it's assumed in here, and we don't count the grass, we don't count fjordland and all these sorts of things. But what is here is how we are measured internationally, and that's the appropriate thing you have in here.
I can't recall when this data first came forward. I might be getting confused with another report, but it was almost referenced as this is the intention of this is also in this context of the strategy to provide a snapshot. And I think we've lost that wording, and I might be confused, it was never in there, but I just recall that discussions around why to put this data in the first place is to provide a snapshot of where the region's at, where it's been heading.
Yep.
And because this data was what was quite contested, as far as, well, this has issues as far as its reporting and what it's suggesting. If there's a slight caveat in there of, well, this isn't the absolute data, there's lots of other considerations and interpretations, but the intention of providing this information in this phase 1 of the strategy is to just provide a bit of a snapshot of what are we talking about when we're talking about emissions, and how does that relate to Southland as a snapshot. I don't know if that can be softened at all,
Well, you could. I think it would be helpful to add, as calculated by an international approved methodology. You know, some wording like that, what that actually is within, you know, IPCC, date, you know, whatever it is, I think would be helpful.
And I was reflecting on some of the comments that this particular information triggered in submissions, and it was important, and even in my own mind, to remind myself that actually, while this probably reflects an international accounting standard, New Zealand has a split gas set of targets, and so when we talk of net zero, it's not suggesting that all of that emissions from agriculture needs to be removed from our region, because the methane targets as they currently stand are only a portion of the methane to be reduced. So that split gas approach isn't reflected anywhere in this information.
Interestingly, sequestration comes up in that table. That's the only time it's mentioned in the whole document. Should it be more explicit somewhere?
Is that in the definitions?
No.
Should we add it to the glossary?
Yeah.
Other thoughts, other themes that people sense may have emerged that may require a response?
I don't know if this is raised, it wasn't necessarily raised in the submissions here, but discussing this data, I believe it was Doug Fraser addressing SDC, and it wasn't mentioned in the submission here, but the concept of forestry sequestration being accounted to Southland regional emissions, but if some of the forestry is actually accounting for sequestration for offshore sequestration. So if there's forests in Southland that are creating sequestration figures, but that's also potentially double dipping if it's being claimed elsewhere.
And he did mention it, and he referred to head office being in the North Island somewhere. Because the head office was there, they got the credits up there, not down here.
So it's just some of those, different, it's the data and how it can be analysed and interpreted.
So what emerges for me is an understanding that still relatively early days, and understanding how to account for and allocate responsibility, I guess, or allocate emissions. I would expect over time we will get better. We will get more certainty around some of these, tricky issues. I just think it's very early days, and this is our best efforts so far. We would expect to get way better at it relatively quickly into the future.
Yeah, at this stage.
The whole issue of accounting, though, is important not only because it's important, but also because it's a question which is continually asked. I mean, we had 4 or 5 submitters ask that question. So, I wonder who's actually dealing with all those peripheral issues around accounting, trying to understand them, but articulate them. Not necessarily these documents, but we need to understand that. That one is completely new to me, that plantations down here might well be credited to the North Island because headquarters are North Island. I never knew that. But I know it can be, that's how exports work. Exports, it depends your port of export. It's not where they're grown, it's where they're exported. So I mean, who's doing that work? Is it ES? Is it Great South? Are we sure that is somebody doing it? Because it's a
Having attended a Climate Change Commission hearing in Gore on at the start of the week, they're adjusting and providing advice to government on what targets might be appropriate what adjusted targets might be appropriate moving forward. And one of the areas they're recommending on is whether or not to include international aviation and shipping amongst our targets. And they spoke to even the challenges of that, there's about 6 different ways you could potentially start to include that in our emissions trading scheme and our targets. Depending on which of those 6 methods you use, will have a slightly different accounting method. But even then, how do you allocate responsibility for a ship that arrives and then goes to the Pacific Islands and goes to Noumea, back to Australia? How do you allocate responsibility for emissions? So, for example, one approach is simply count for how much refueling occurs while they're in your territory, and that's your methods for accounting for that. So I suspect that it's, in my mind, we're going to have to continue to work at a national level to establish what's the appropriate way to account for New Zealand's, quite bespoke national targets in a way that also allows them to be translated to meet our international reporting and nationally determined contributions. So I think it is probably going to be a national and nationally defined way of doing it moving forward. I'm not sure if it's apparent available to us at the moment, but
through you, Chair, they put some commentary together for the panel to consider, including in the draft decision around the whole space of accounting and the issues and responsibilities. So.
Perhaps you know the answer to the original question asked, which is which group is accountable for overseeing, understanding that issue? Do Great South do that work, or the ES do that work, or is there
at a national level, there are national processes in play around that. Down here, Great South have been doing that space up to date. So.
Okay, thank you.
If there are no other themes that people feel need to be carried forward or responded to, so proposed changes to the strategy. What is the process? Assessment of whether the changes being proposed are considered to be minor in nature or extensive in nature. And the answer to that question will kind of influence what is the process to be taken forward from here. Are we suggesting minor changes, or are we suggesting big sweeping changes? We've got 2 pathways mapped out depending on what the answer is. But maybe before we explore what each of those pathways are, maybe a quick straw poll around the panel.
I think minor's a bad word because it implies that they're unimportant, and actually, we've heard some stuff which has helped us and change the document in a way which is going to be a better document going forward. But in terms of whether they change the sense of the document in any way or the intent of it, I don't think they do. I think their clarification tighten the document up. So let's not use the word minor, but I think the sense of that is that they're on that side of the ledger.
Matt, would you be in the same sort of mind space?
Yeah, I mean they're not minor because they hold relevance. It's points of clarification and points of reference based on the feedback of a pretty thorough submission process.
I agree.
So on that basis then, what we're proposing as the process from here, given that there hasn't been a significant shift in the structure and intent of the document, the steps that are outlined here. So we've done the initial deliberations and we've discussed the key themes that have arisen. So bullet point 2 is to flag or note are there any further information requirements, and that's to be directed by the Regional Climate Change Working Group hearing panel during deliberation. So, for example, we've identified we want to clarify that information that we've included from the Great South report. That's an example of some additional information we need. Are there any other information needs that we think we're going to need to either finalise the strategy or support our response to the people who submitted to us.
That one's the only one on my list.
The Great South report. Yep. Okay. The third bullet point there is then final deliberations. So a meeting date to be set to reconvene the hearing panel, and staff are suggesting in June. That will allow time to rework the edits that have been suggested in today's deliberations, share them back to the for consideration before we reconvene. And I'm thinking, is this, you're anticipating online for this one? Okay.
I'd rather be here.
You'd rather be here?
Yeah,
Okay.
eye to eye.
Yep. And in terms of those final deliberations, it's the idea is for staff to potentially develop draft decisions to be worked through as part of that final meeting. And a formal response by the panel to each submitter will need to be finalised at that particular meeting. Does step 3 make sense to people?
Can I give some guidance on dates?
Yes.
In that I have 4 days without hearings or other meetings next month, being the 13th, 14th, 19th and 20th
of June.
Thank you.
Give you a lot of spare time. 4 days.
We've got 2 weeks of hearings next month. District plan.
Step 4 is then a recommendation from the Regional Climate Change Working Group hearing panel to each individual agency. So that's Te Marama and the 4 councils receiving the, and essentially that is the refined regional climate change strategy as endorsed by this hearing panel. A regional climate change working group interagency report drafted to provide context and recommendation to adopt the regional climate change strategy, and a formal response to each submitter would be part of the appendix to an interagency report. And then finally, each agency to then take this to their governance for consideration and adoption to complete the phase 1 work.
At what point would you see the formal response going to each submitter? Because if we're getting together in June, it could well be July by the time it gets to a council meeting.
Too long, you're thinking?
We can do a formal response that says our recommendations are.
Sounds very sensible to me for you, Chair.
Is that like a accepted way of doing it, or is that?
So it's quite an unusual process for us, but to me that seems like it meets all the requirements.
The reason I quite like that is that then it alerts people that, okay, if I want to remain engaged on this topic, I can go and attend the Gore District Council meeting where it's to be adopted or discussed and adopted by each individual agency.
Not only can you go, but you can also public forum and we'll see again if you wish.
So I think that's a positive way to approach that. So the challenge then will be just to find a day that in June that's going to work for everyone, and we'll follow that up as a. Can we just quickly look at what the alternate would have been on the next slide? It's a more simple, not developed in quite the same detail. I just wanted to make sure that people had a chance to view that as part of our understanding of what may have emerged had we had a sense that there was a significant shift in the structure and intent of the strategy. Does that trigger questions for anyone?
I think that would be overkill given the changes that we've agreed. That would be unwelcome because there's enough work on it.
And we did hear from some that there's probably a bit of consultation fatigue already sitting in. So, yeah, that's that's the process we will be following, as I say. So there'll be some material to read ahead of that engagement in June, once we work out which of those 4 potential dates we might be able to get everyone together. And we probably continue to accept that a quorum of 4 is the minimum needed if we find that someone can't make an engagement that's proposed. All right. This brings us to the closing session in my agenda. Okay, sorry, yes, Matt.
One other little suggestion,
Please.
based on feedback and in the glossary, the actual meaning of climate change. So we includes natural internal climate processes and external climate forcing, such as variations in solar cycles, volcanic eruptions, and persistent anthropogenic changes. I wonder whether in that glossary of climate change we include the long-term historic climate change factor of the Little Ice Age as another component to a changing climate. We're mentioning, volcanic eruptions and solar cycles, plus the anthropogenic changes. So including the historic changing climate, ever-changing climate.
So what you're talking about is the way that climate would change prior to the Industrial Revolution, where we started burning fossil fuel at a rapid rate.
Yeah, so including into that glossary that also the natural climate cycles of the Earth are included into that consideration.
Is that not exactly what it says in the second sentence? Includes natural internal climate processes.
Is that what that's referring to?
Well, it's just natural climate processes. I'm not sure what internal means, but
I guess I was thinking that whether you use that term or whether climate variability, natural variability, whether there was a suitable definition for that, I'm not certain. I know in this case we've drawn that one from the National Adaptation Plan and structuring that or providing that definition. We could explore and perhaps come back whether there was a natural climate variation definition or description that would be helpful. Anka, you've got a thought on this one? Oh, there is climate variability over the page. Okay. Sorry, which kind of does that.
Yeah, it does, yeah. I guess in the glossary we got climate change, though in the document we're talking about a changing climate. So yeah, at least what we've heard is there are lots of contributing factors to the changing climate, and some submitters' interpretation is the long historic trend of the Earth and a changing climate. On top of that, other factors like evolution and volcanoes and such. So yeah, just checking that the glossary is incorporating all of those thoughts. Yeah, it does if you go through them. That's all.
No, thank you. And I'd rather that we paused and discussed these issues rather than bypass them and have people leave the meeting feeling that they haven't given voice to a possible concern or anxiety. So just then in the final session, again, just circling back, are there key reflections on this process or what has emerged from this process that panel members wish to share? Certainly from my point of view, it's been the first occasion to be involved in a process of public consultation. Wasn't quite sure what to expect, I must admit, but in some respects I'm reassured by the process and that it provides an opportunity for members of the public to voice their perspectives, their concerns, and for us to respond to those as we consider what's the appropriate pathway forward.
One of my reflections is that while all of us, the elected representatives, have given up our time and to focus on this, a significant workload has fallen to you, Phil. And the way that you've handled this process is to be commended, so thank you.
I've learned a lot, actually. And I think that's another important part of the submission process, that you're not always able to agree with everybody, but by hearing, different viewpoints, you actually learn something yourself. So I certainly feel as though, listening to, people like Dawn and that, I mean, I've actually learned a lot of things that I never knew.
I think the overwhelming support for collaboration on this topic is really impressive from the community, and I guess it makes me then wonder what other work streams and areas of collaboration would the region benefit from if this one topic has had this level of engagement. The conversation around regional spatial planning and those things that are more than just climate change. It'll be interesting to approach all of these challenges and conversations going forward with this level of collaboration.
Getting us as far has been great. A lot of time and effort from people and support that's been sent, and being part of it, that is a responsibility, kaitiaki responsibility for us and our future generations. That's important. So to hear everyone's voice in affirmative, negative in terms of climate change, it was really good to be able to hear all those different voices to lead us into the future. So, and I guess just in response, Keith, to your comment, I just want to acknowledge the staff support that has enabled this to occur. And I know that staff have had to trade in a little bit of goodwill, given that they are racing the clock and it's been a bit of a crunch period. Falling in favours with other members of their family to do, school pickups and things. So I appreciate the effort that staff have put into enable this within pretty tight timeframes to be progressed. I expect that the next bullet point on my agenda was to ask for key messages, but I've actually sensed that reflective session or those reflections that people have shared have actually touched upon many of the key messages around learning, the benefits of collaboration. I think, Matt, to perhaps extend that, one way that I think collaboration is helpful is it also holds each of us and our respective agencies to account to a degree. Having others, challenge your ideas, your thinking, and keeping you honest. And I see that as one benefit of a collaborative effort on this particular challenge. So I think there's quite a number of layers of benefits that flow from collaboration, albeit at times it can require a bit of extra work to make it happen. Are there other key messages, though, you want to add at this point as we approach the close of the deliberations? For me, I would publicly thank all those people who did submit and who did take time to come and speak with us. The process depends upon that type of engagement, and people sacrificed their time and paid and sacrificed, gave their attention to support their submissions. So I think that's really worth acknowledging. Makes for supports and democratic outcomes. Any other key messages people want to capture? Actually, another key message from me is that I look forward to meaningfully progressing the phase 2 work that will follow and build upon this foundation. Right. If there are no other key messages, I just want to close by thanking everyone for your participation, support, and attendance. Reminder that this is not quite the end of the journey. There is that one final engagement that we anticipate in June to close this off, to be able to take
a product forward to our respective councils and governance for consideration. Are there any final comments from the floor before we close the meeting?
Can I ask a question of the floor?
Yes.
Rhiannon, given ICC presumably want to build this into a long-term plan, and given the long-term plan is finalised is it end of June? Are we, well, constrained is not the right word, as a timetable which we are painting for, where we go with the next steps, is that going to satisfy that? It would mean taking it to the June council meeting, wouldn't it? Sorry, speak up, Rhiannon.
I'm going to the process. I think that we are going to be fine to refer to the draft visual language strategy. As this is a draft at the end of June. Noting the large substances there and that are direction.
Okay, thank you.
On that basis then, I might ask Dean if you would be good enough to close our meeting with a karakia.
Kia ora tātou, e mahi e te mahi motu hake o tātou, o ngā ore muriaki nei. Nā reira, nohea ki rongo e noho i te kāinga, mi hatu ki a koutou. Koutou e noho i konei, i wanganui tēnei tepu, ki raro te tūnu o tō tātou whare, tēnā koutou. Mi hatu ki a koe, Phil, e whakahaere tia tō tātou kaupapa, te kai whakahaere o te wānei, tātou o rangatira. Huri ki te atua, nā tūpuna te aki manaki e mātou, ki rongi te huarahi mui a tātou, kia whai hua tika pono mō mātou mō ngā ore muriaki nei. Whakatau tō rangi Māori ki rongi a tātou, nā te atua nā tūpuna. Tēnei tēnei watu ki a koe, manaki tia e a mātou i ngā wā katoa. Huri ki a koe rongo whia, whakairi aki ki ronga whakamaua ki tēnā haumea hui. Tā e ki e. Kia ora koutou, thank you.
Thank you, indeed.
Thank you. Thank you.